Everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. The BEAD Notice of Funding Opportunity has all kinds of rules in there, many of which, probably most of which, are promoting the deployment of universal broadband to everybody and that they go towards that goal. There are some requirements that seem to be an impediment to that goal. We'll be right back and we'll talk about some of the labor requirements. Thanks for joining me, Rick Uzzi, here with Broadband Deployment News from Zecorum. So I saw this blog post by Doug Dawson. He writes quite a bit on the broadband industry. He's a contractor who's runs a contracting business, who's been in the business a long time. CCG Consulting, that's Doug right there. So I wanted to go through this post of his. I think he makes a lot of good points about the Notice of Funding Opportunity and the labor requirements in there. And this is something that I've had a problem with as well, because it seems like a lot of times when you get these big programs, and especially if they're, play favorites here, especially if they're from the Democratic side of the aisle, a lot of times there's more in here. There's a lot of more regulations and things in there that are needed sometimes, or certainly things that can make the deployment of this more expensive, more difficult, presents obstacles, those kinds of things. And in this case, especially for smaller operators. So we see that, I think, with the, there's environmental things in here that operators, the state broadband offices and operators need to be looking at. And, there's not that much related to that in the broadband world. And then you've got the labor stuff that's going to make things more difficult as well. So this specifically covers the labor things right here. So you see, another red flag for the BEAD labor requirements. So I'll read through this. The BEAD grant rules established by the NTIA are going to be a difficult hurdle for many ISPs. It says, I think most ISPs reading the NTIA's Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, will find things on the list of requirements that will be hard or difficult to meet. If you're thinking of applying to BEAD, you should read these rules carefully. After reading this blog, the rules start on page 56 of the NOFO. And he's got a link here that probably goes to that. And I actually linked in the description of this video. You can go here and download that and just click on the related documents right there. And then that will bring you can download that to the NOFO. And then I guess as he's saying, starting on page 56, you see here fair labor practices and highly skilled workforce and all of this stuff in here that you can read through on that. So, and he covers this in pretty good detail here. So we'll read through this. Without trying to sound too critical, the labor requirements sound like something written by bureaucrats who are designing a hypothetically perfect labor system instead of written by folks who have ever built a broadband network and have dealt with broadband contractors. Let's run through some of the requirements to make this point. And that's, again, a common thing with some of these broadband programs, because you got the people that are writing it sometimes have never been in a business. I mean, they come out of college, they're in Washington, they go to work immediately. These could be staffers of Congress people and whatnot. So a lot of times these folks have no business experience, and a lot of times we get regulations and legislation that doesn't fully understand what businesses have to go through and the lay of the land out there. So it's just something we have to deal with. So he starts here by saying, those seeking grants must demonstrate that they intend to comply with federal labor and employment laws. I think every grant I've ever worked with, and this is Doug speaking obviously, has the same requirement, which is usually satisfied by having an officer of the applicant attest that they will follow the law. However, the NOFO goes much further than that. It says a grant office must obtain an applicant's record of compliance with federal laws, as well as the records of any entities that will participate in the project, including contractors and subcontractors. This will require an ISP to specifically identify contractors and subcontractors before filing for a grant. All of these entities must prove their past compliance with federal labor laws. This is not how the industry functions. The entire industry works on a system of primary construction contractors and a host of smaller subcontractor crews. Big ISPs like Charter and Frontier can easily identify their primary contractor because they will have them under contract to handle whatever future work comes along. Smaller ISPs typically find a primary contractor after they know they have a project, like after they win a grant. And this brings up, just in general, if you think about this, and what's going to be happening. So, we have different broadband deployment projects going on right now. Some of them are private construction. Some of them are funded by the government through ARPA or RDOF or USDA Reconnect. And they're kind of hitting here and there. They're not all hitting at once. Well, we're going to have sometime, each state's going to want to, as quickly as possible, get these funds working. So they're going to go through the process of they've got their 5-year plan. They got to do their initial proposal, their final proposal. In between that, they've got to do challenges. They're going to be doing that as quickly as possible. Some states are going to be going faster than others, but they're all going to be operating on the idea that we need to get these dollars out so that we can get these networks constructed. So I think we'll be seeing at some point, and I think it's probably going to be springtime to summertime next year, that a lot of the states are going to be through with the process. They're going to know who their subgrantees are, and they're going to start subgranting that money down to the internet service providers in their state, or those that will become internet service providers, like maybe a municipality or electric co-op that's never done it before, but there still are somebody that will be doing that. So all of this work is going to be hitting at once, and then you're going to have this demand of workers to do this. And we're already aware of this, and there are some organizations that are trying to help. I know the Fiber Broadband Association is trying to help get people trained up. A lot of states are looking at what they can do, and they're looking ahead to try to figure out how this is going to all play out. But again, a lot of these contractors, subcontractors, they're going to be going where the jobs are. So that's why I think everybody's going to want to get their jobs going first if they can, so that they can kind of claim some of these workers that are out there, because a state might not have enough. They might have to draw from other locations, those kinds of things. So it's going to be a challenge. He says, I wrote a recent blog that talked about the problems that small ISPs are having in getting projects constructed. I have an example of a financially stable ISP that couldn't find a contractor in today's market to build a few small projects funded by ARPA grants. This difficulty came after the ISP had already had the projects and funding in hand. I can't imagine rural contractors that will be willing to sign on a grant project at the application stage when they don't even know if the ISP will win the grant. This requirement shows a total lack of understanding of how small construction contractors function. Their number one goal is to always keep crews working. They choose projects based on the timing of the work, the level of the payment, and the location. So again, as different states come out with funding, and these contractors could go off and do something else, and that's just going to make it hard to kind of balance where the workers are. And it reminds me of just trying to get a car repaired recently. I mean, I don't know if this is going to continue, but if you need to get a car repaired right now, at least in our area, it can take weeks. Somebody was quoted the other day that it could take January before they could get their car fixed. And some of this has to do with the fact that we've come out of the pandemic, and there are a lot of people that were working before that just don't really want to work now. And we may be seeing some of that impact in the area here where you've got fiber construction. It's just harder now to get people to work on various projects. And he's stating here that he had this particular situation he knew of with this ARPA funding. It's inconceivable to me that the typical contractor will agree to sign on to a grant project even before the grant application. That is forcing contractors to pick ISPs they think will win grants. And I can't see them doing that. I could see some of these ISPs going out and making sure that the contractors are meeting all of these requirements that they have. But there's no contractor that's going to sign up until they actually have the business. The NTIA rules seem to want to make sure that all work is done by quality contractors by making applicants and contractors pair off even before winning a grant. I can think of a dozen ways how this can backfire on a contractor that agrees to work for a given grant project when it can't possibly know if and when that grant will be awarded and when construction will start. And that's true. I can't conceive of that either. This requirement also shows a lack of understanding about the makeup of the construction companies that build broadband infrastructure. Underneath the prime contractors are normally a host of small subcontractors, even for projects built by the giant ISPs. Subcontractors are often single crews who hire on to projects. These small crews come and go. I've never heard of any sizable broadband project that could identify the small subcontractors that would eventually work on the project. Crews regularly leave and get replaced as needed during most projects, and that's because they're contractors. They work as needed. There's no way that these small 6-technician crews will sign on to theoretical grant projects 2 years before the start of construction. Only in a fantasy world can a contractor promise to make up the subcontractor workforce over the life of a multi-year construction project. The NOFO suggests ways around this requirement, which it knows is hard, by suggesting that ISPs directly hire the labor force. I laughed out loud at that idea in an environment where ISPs are having trouble keeping existing staff or hiring new staff. That goes back to what I was saying about it's just hard to hire people in many different disciplines right now. Trying to build A grant project with employees might be the riskiest strategy of all. Most ISPs I know have an ethical problem hiring crews that they will let go in 3 or 4 years at the end of the grant construction. And it's hard to envision that an ISP can attract technicians who understand that work will be temporary. Building networks with employees will also require buying expensive construction equipment that would have no use past the term of the grant. This idea is impractical since there is still a multi-year backlog in the supply chain for specialized fiber construction equipment. Plus, do we really want to require that an ISP must buy $1 million of boring equipment just to win a grant? And he doesn't mean equipment that bores you. He means equipment that bores a hole. I just found that funny, boring equipment. It might be boring. It's pretty technical maybe, but in any event, this would be equipment to bore, to bury fiber. Can the NTIA please invent more ways to make it even more expensive to take the BEAD funding? They probably could if given the chance, I'm afraid to say, because again, bureaucracy and red tape can be rampant sometimes in Washington. So yes, they probably could. I wouldn't ask for that. The NOFO also has a strong preference for using unionized contractors and getting a labor agreement specific to the grant project. And that's something that's in there as well because, labor, again, I was mentioning the Democratic kind of side of the aisle, labor unions are a big contributor to Democratic campaigns, so they try to protect labor unions whenever they can. The NOFO even suggests labor peace accords where workers agreed to not strike or disrupt work during the life of the grant. It seems like a big stretch to get unions to make such agreements for theoretical grant projects that may not be built for many years into the future. The NOFO also places a huge emphasis on having appropriately skilled and credentialed workforce, including by the subgrantee and each of its contractors and subcontractors. Well, that's a fine statement. It's fine to have appropriately skilled and credentialed, not necessarily credentialed, let's say, but appropriately skilled. There's always a question. A lot of times there's various hurdles that people have to do to be able to provide services, and a lot of times some of those hurdles are licenses and credentials that really aren't as helpful or meaningful as they could be or should be or may not even be needed. So I think that's a problem there. So this means using a workforce where all members of the project workforce will have appropriate credentials, for example, appropriate and relevant pre-existing occupational training, certification, and licensure. So again, this is right out of the NOFO here. For projects that don't use union labor, NTIA wants to see that every employee, including contractors and subcontractors, has safety training, certification, and/or licensure requirements. For example, OSHA 10, OSHA 30, confined space, traffic control, or other training is relevant depending on title work, including whether there is a robust in-house training program with established requirements tied to certifications, titles, and information on the professional certifications and/or in-house training in place to ensure that deployment is done at a high standard. And again, some of this I think is kind of aimed at a preference for union labor because unions will say, well, we've got our union has trained work staff and they can get certified through the unions, I guess, those kinds of things. And it's saying if you're not going to use union labor, then you need to kind of jump through these hoops to do that. So again, that makes it more challenging for the internet service providers. Anybody that's trying to hire labor for this, whether it's unionized labor or not, is going to have a difficult time. Whoever wrote the NOFO, this is Doug speaking again, has no understanding of the construction crews who build networks. There's only been a handful of certification programs around the industry for decades, and only a small percentage of technicians who build networks have any formal certification. So is that good or bad? Well, a formal certification, if somebody is trained and if they've been trained and they go through the process, they could be an apprentice, and go through the process and learn everything and not have to have a piece of paper hanging on their wall that says they're certified. They could be really good at their job. They could know more than some guy who's gone through a certification process and has maybe a year of experience, and they've got maybe 10, 15 years of experience. They're going to know more. They're going to be able to do it better. So this is a hurdle that doesn't necessarily need to be there. I think we want trained people, but we don't have to have hurdles in place that would get the trained people or be able to get the trained people to do the job. I think every ISP will agree with me that they want a crew made up of construction veterans with a decade or two of experience rather than a crew that has technicians with newly minted certifications. Now, there is going to be a lot of folks, I think, that are going to be brand new to the job. Now, whether or not they get some kind of certification, they're going to be going through some kind of a training program. Could be with internet service providers. It could be with colleges. Like, as I mentioned, it could be through something like the Fiber Broadband Association, where they're working with local colleges on these fiber training kinds of things. And they could get that kind of a certification. But they're going to be new. So they're going to have to gain experience as they go. And hopefully we'll have enough experienced people to work with the newly trained people to be able to work together. And then they can get more real world experience as they're going through that. It's hard to know if this is intentional, but it's intentional. It's hard to know if this is intentional, but like many of the BEAD requirements suggested by NTIA, these labor requirements greatly favor large ISPs over small ones. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I don't think it's necessarily intentional about that. I don't think they're intentionally doing this to favor the large ISPs. I think it's intentional to try to cover some of these things, including, like I say, a preference for labor unions. That part I think is intentional. I think they'd prefer that small providers, could be municipalities, like I say, electric membership co-ops. They'd prefer that, if you read through the NOFO, not-for-profits actually be the people deploying this. They don't necessarily want the big, huge mega providers, the Comcasts and the AT&Ts and others to be doing this work. They'd really prefer those that are, again, going to do this for minimal profit, just not for profit, just to cover costs. Yeah, that's not their goal there. I think most smaller ISPs will be unable to identify contractors and subcontractors ahead of time and convince contractors to provide their history of adherence to federal law, have all certified employees, and jump through a mountain of paperwork. If I was a contractor, I wouldn't touch a BEAD grant project with a 10-foot pole. There is plenty of other work available. So that's an interesting statement. And he is a contractor in a sense. I mean, he does these kinds of things. So what he's saying is, that paperwork, a lot of times, especially smaller companies who could be doing a good job with, let's say, a federal grant, will look at it and go, ugh, this is just not worth it. And unfortunately, most of the time, that's because of all of the hoops and mountains of paperwork that you have to go through to do that. So it would be better if we stuck to what the goal is, what is really important to get quality, reliable broadband to everybody in the country, and take everything else out and only keep the stuff that's really important. But this is the government, so that's unlikely to happen. He does say here, I hope that state broadband offices push back hard on these requirements to make them realistic. That won't be easy because some of these rules seem mandatory, but not all. I strongly urge state broadband offices to sit and talk with local ISP and construction operators about the hurdles created by these rules, because these requirements will stop quality ISPs from pursuing BEAD grants. And I agree with him there that there are a lot of, like I say, a lot of maybe smaller ISPs that have a lot of experience in their area that would be perfect for serving maybe adjacent areas to them, but they haven't had the funds to be able to deploy that. They'd be perfect to go seek funding in those areas. They could continue where they are today. And I'm thinking of independent ISPs that may serve several cities in a state, or several towns in a state, a certain area. And there's other more rural areas near them that they can't serve. They just haven't been able to make a ROI case for doing that. And they'd be perfect for entering that area. But when they look at these kinds of requirements, they might think there's no way that I can do that or that I want to do that. So yeah, it would be great if there could be some waivers or some other things as some of these smaller operators, as the states look at and see who they're going to choose to deploy broadband in certain areas, that they could somehow work with them and ease some of these burdens, because it's going to be difficult. And again, it's going to be difficult anyway. Even without all of these regulations and rules in place and labor force kind of regulations, it's going to be hard to find enough people to do this. And this is just putting an additional really big roadblock in the way of getting people that can, quality people that can do this work. Thanks for joining me today. If this was helpful, if you give me a like on the video, I'd appreciate it. If you're not subscribed, click the subscribe button, ring the bell, and you'll be notified when I'm live. I appreciate it. See you next time. Bye-bye.